YouTube, how you all doing? So these settings are my settings that I use for Warzone. It's a good insight to what I use and what I turn on and turn off, and kind of like adjust slightly to make sure that I get the most FPS possible out of my system. These are in-game settings that you can adjust yourself, and hopefully this is a good insight for you guys to kind of see what kind of settings you could have on and what you can apply to make your game run a bit smoother or a little bit better in quality. So my standard of gameplay, I generally want to hit that 144 frames per second mark, but in all honesty I also want a decent looking game as well. So it's understandable when things getting busy on screen, things will start dipping down to the 110, 120 frames per second mark, and that's absolutely fine by me. So I'm rocking a 2K resolution, the 1440p, 144 frames per second monitor. In all honesty, that is a little bit too high, especially for this graphics card to hit those 144 frames per second. So what I do first off is reduce my render resolution down to 75, and for you, if you want to reduce that even more to 720p, that is where the biggest increase is going to show, dropping that render resolution down. Doing some tests, we're running around about on 1440p, 122 frames per second at the lowest settings possible, and on 1080p we're running around about 164 frames per second at the lowest possible. So it's pretty doable, but again there's that 40 FPS difference between 1080p to 1440p. But moving forward, our display mode is pretty much full screen borderless. I understand full screen can give you the most benefit in terms of input lag, but I like to alt tab out into Discord and into stream whenever I can, so I like to have that on there without having my entire screen go black and kind of freak it out a little bit. So aspect ratio, this is how wide, so I just leave it in automatic. V-Sync, I turn this off. Caps it at 60 frames per second. It kind of really, when I turn that on, it really messed up my eyes. It would give me a headache actually. So if you're experiencing headaches and jitters and you have this on, turn it off, dude. I have this set to unlimited just for like testing today, but generally I would set this to custom, 144 frames per second gameplay limit, and then 60 there. NVIDIA highlights is disabled, and it actually does help with FPS in itself, but I do generally record a lot whilst I'm gaming, so I go through the NVIDIA shadow play, and these are my settings. My texture resolution is set to normal. In all honesty, again going back to the idea that I want a decent looking game, this normal compared to very low graphically is a big issue to me. It kind of looks really strange, but even though I've had it on very low for a long time, putting it to normal doesn't really drop things too much in my opinion. So this texture filler, I generally have it around about low. Particle quality is a weird one, set it to high. Generally it doesn't really affect anything, in fact it might even improve some stuff, but that's a weird one. Bullet impacts doesn't really change anything in terms of FPS, so we're just going to leave it enabled. Tessellation, I generally set this to near because of course when we're in Warzone it's going to be more demanding on your system, trying to load in that extra geometry, there we go, there's words today. Shadow map resolution, I have this to low. Generally setting this any higher than this will reduce my FPS quite a bit, because of course it's trying to load in the textures on the floor of the shadows. The cache, spot and sun shadows improve performance for me. In changing over to the 3200 memory clock RAM, this actually stores it within that, so it technically reduces the load from your GPU, minuscule of course, but it does generally improve FPS, only by a couple though, so that's pretty cool. Particle lighting, I generally have this to normal. Of course when things get busy on screen and there's a lot of explosions, especially in like close quarter kind of combat in more multiplayer, you know, I kind of don't want things to kind of blow up. Ray tracing, of course I've got that feature, but it just kills your FPS. It looks great in cinematic terms, but in actual gameplay, nah. Ambient Inclusion is a weird one because it actually reduces FPS, yes, but if you actually don't have the anti-aliasing set to this one, the T2 or the T2X, essentially it doesn't really work that well. It actually introduces noise, and if you don't know anything about anti-aliasing, the higher it is, the more FPS it's going to want. So I generally leave this disabled because I don't have the anti-aliasing at the right amount that the Ambient Inclusion wants me to have it at. The screen space reflection, again, same kind of story. It kind of wants the anti-aliasing to be high, and I just don't have it high because of this here. I have it at SMAA 1 times. Is honestly enough for the lines to not look jagged and weird, but it's not high enough to cause that much FPS drop in my opinion. A great tip is that if you have it on SMAA, if you set the filmic strength to 1, it actually benefits the SMAA in itself, and it will actually avoid noise. The depth of field is disabled for me, the world motion blur, the weapon motion blur, and the film grain is all off for me. I don't like that kind of thing. It makes things look weird, motion blur. I never liked it in games, so we're just gonna leave it there. So let's apply that. And the last thing I want to kind of talk about is in the general settings, and that's field of view. Honestly, the lower this is, you don't necessarily, how should I explain this? Consoles is around, I think consoles is 80. I need to double check this. I think it's either 80 or 90. If someone wants to confirm that in the comment section down below, that'd be great. Thanks. The lower it is, 60, it's going to make the game feel slower and a little bit more zoomed in. Higher, it's going to make the game feel faster, and you're going to be able to see more. Now, if you're thinking about it, the idea behind, if you could see more with 120 and you can see less with 60, of course you should set it as low as possible for it to have the biggest increase of FPS, and that's absolutely false. It's the opposite. With it being 60, it's actually loading in more because it can be more refined with the space it's got, whereas the 120 kind of just stretches and kind of like blurs everything out. You don't necessarily benefit from having 120 on, and you don't necessarily benefit from having 60 on. You kind of want somewhere in between, either between 80 to 110. Now, I know people who go up to 120, and that's absolutely fine. The higher you go, the better it is, rather than the lower you go, in all honesty. So if you kind of want an improved performance, I have it set to 100 field of view, but if you feel like, oh, I want a couple more frames per second, I don't mind the game feeling a bit faster, then set it up to 120 or something like that. It would generally help you out. Bit of a thing there. And there you have it. That's generally my graphics settings and my general settings in its sense to help the FPS count of your game. If you want a bit more of an in-depth about the Windows settings, the control panel settings, or anything like that, or if you want to look more into my keyboard and mouse settings, just leave a like, leave a comment down below, and I'll surely get onto that eventually. So I appreciate you guys stopping by. Hopefully this video wasn't too long. I kind of went into a bit more explanation about certain things, but I appreciate you stopping by, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. See you later.